By early 1943, the tide of war had shifted dramatically against Germany. The Wehrmacht, once a seemingly unstoppable force, was reeling from a series of catastrophic defeats. Stalingrad had fallen, leaving an entire army encircled and destroyed, a loss that shocked both soldiers and civilians alike. The surrender of over 90,000 men was more than a military disaster. It was a blow to the myth of German invincibility that Hitler had meticulously built. In the East, the German army faced mounting pressure from the Soviets, who were not only recovering from previous losses, but were now growing stronger with every passing month. The summer brought the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, where Hitler had hoped to regain the initiative. Instead, it ended in a decisive Soviet victory. German forces suffered enormous casualties, losing hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers. This defeat exposed the limits of blitzkrieg tactics when applied against well-prepared defensive lines and an opponent with superior numbers and industrial capacity. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Rommel's forces were pushed back, culminating in the surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops. The Mediterranean, once dominated by German and Italian forces, now slipped from Axis control, leaving the southern flank of Europe vulnerable. Even more troubling for Hitler was the defection of Italy. Mussolini, once a key ally, was overthrown and replaced by a government willing to negotiate with the Allies. This not only threatened Germany's southern defenses, but symbolized the fragility of Hitler's alliances. Germany now faced the daunting reality of fighting on multiple fronts: the Soviet juggernaut to the east, the increasingly coordinated Anglo-American forces in the west, and a destabilized southern front. Industrial production could not keep pace. Allied factories operating at a scale and efficiency Germany could not match produced weapons and vehicles at a rate 10 times that of the Reich. Within the Wolf's Lair, the tension was palpable. Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl repeatedly urged Hitler to consider the possibility of a negotiated settlement. They warned that without a dramatic shift in strategy, Germany was heading toward irreversible collapse. The generals argued that peace might preserve some semblance of the Reich, even if it required painful concessions. They emphasized the stark contrast between Germany's dwindling resources and the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies. Yet Hitler remained unyielding, dismissing their pleas as defeatist fantasies. He believed that any sign of weakness would destroy the ideological and psychological foundation of the German state. To him, surrender was synonymous with humiliation, betrayal, and the collapse of everything he had built. The German people were beginning to feel the strain of total war. Bombing raids over German cities, shortages of food and materials, and news of defeats on multiple fronts eroded morale. Soldiers returning from the front spoke of the Soviets' relentless push and the Allies' unyielding advance. Yet Hitler, isolated in his command bunkers, framed these setbacks not as a reflection of Germany's limitations, but as temporary obstacles that could be overcome through willpower, ideology, and relentless pursuit of his vision. He believed that the Allies were vulnerable to division, that internal conflicts between the Western powers and the Soviets would soon fracture their coalition. This miscalculation would reinforce his refusal to negotiate, even as reality screamed otherwise. Despite mounting losses, Hitler's public rhetoric projected confidence and inevitability. Propaganda celebrated the courage of German soldiers, while the state-controlled media minimized defeats and exaggerated victories. Inside the military high command, however, there was growing frustration. Generals quietly documented losses, analyzed enemy capabilities, and tried to persuade Hitler that continued offensive operations were unsustainable. Each failed offensive, each encirclement, and each strategic misstep only deepened the disconnect between Hitler's perception and the unfolding reality on the ground. By the end of 1943, Germany had lost momentum on all major fronts. Stalingrad was gone. Kursk had failed. North Africa was lost. Italy had switched sides, and the Allies' combined industrial output continued to dwarf German production. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, resources were dwindling, and the possibility of victory was slipping further away with every passing month. Yet Hitler refused to consider any option that might lead to peace. The convergence of military disaster, overextended supply lines, and a collapsing alliance system did not shake his resolve. The world watched as Germany, once the dominant power in Europe, hurtled toward a crisis from which retreat, negotiation, or compromise was no longer psychologically or ideologically imaginable. Every general in the room understood the stakes, yet Hitler's vision, his ideology, and his personal refusal to accept failure would determine the course of a nation teetering on the brink of destruction. By the middle of 1943, the reality of Germany's precarious military situation was undeniable to many within the high command. Yet Hitler's refusal to consider peace was never simply a matter of stubbornness or pride. It was rooted in a rigid, uncompromising ideology that shaped every decision he made. To Hitler, accepting any negotiated settlement would not only mean the temporary loss of territory or soldiers, it would represent a betrayal of the entire racial and political vision that had defined the Third Reich since its inception. The Thousand-Year Reich, which he claimed would dominate Europe for generations, could not be reconciled with compromise, surrender, or concessions. Hitler's worldview was built around an obsessive belief in the superiority of the so-called Aryan race and the inherent inferiority of Germany's enemies. For him, the war was more than a struggle for territory or resources. It was a cosmic conflict between superior and inferior peoples. The thought of negotiating with nations he considered racially and ideologically flawed was unthinkable. To accept peace, even under the most favorable conditions, would have been an admission that these inferior nations had defeated him, shattering the core of his worldview. It would mean conceding that his vision of racial hierarchy and historical destiny was flawed. This ideological rigidity extended beyond mere racial theories. Hitler's vision of Europe was total and absolute. He had meticulously planned a future in which Germany would dominate politically, economically, and militarily, while subjugating or eliminating populations he deemed undesirable. Any peace settlement, no matter how temporary or strategic, would require abandoning this project. Cities, territories, and resources that had been seized through conquest could not simply be returned without undermining the ideological foundations of the regime. Hitler could not tolerate the idea that the Reich might exist as a diminished state, forced into compromise or reduced to the role of a subordinate power. Within the military command, generals attempted to frame their appeals in pragmatic terms. They argued that Germany could preserve its core territories, reorganize its forces, and negotiate conditions that might save millions of lives. They presented Hitler with projections showing that continued warfare against the industrial might of the Allies was unsustainable, emphasizing the contrast between German production and that of the United States and Britain. Yet Hitler dismissed these arguments outright, framing them as betrayals of National Socialism itself. To him, conceding even a single inch of conquered land was tantamount to abandoning the destiny of the German people. Hitler's personal identification with the Reich made compromise psychologically impossible. He did not see himself as merely a political leader making tactical decisions. He was the embodiment of Germany's resurgence, the singular architect of its triumphs, and the arbiter of its future. Failure in any form was a threat to his identity. To negotiate, to accept peace, would have been an admission that the destiny he had crafted for the German nation was reversible, that his personal power and vision were fallible. The very notion of defeat was incompatible with the man who had risen to power, promising restoration and ultimate dominance. Even when confronted with concrete evidence of Germany's limitations, dwindling fuel supplies, overstretched armies, and devastating losses in men and equipment, Hitler reframed setbacks as temporary external obstacles rather than indicators of strategic reality. Ideology served as both a lens and a shield, allowing him to interpret the world in a manner that justified continued aggression. Every defeat was rationalized as a test of resolve, every loss portrayed as temporary, and every suggestion of peace dismissed as a betrayal of the German race. Hitler also believed that ideological conviction would inspire the German people and the military to achieve the impossible. He trusted that determination and belief in the racial destiny of Germany could compensate for material inferiority. Soldiers were expected to fight not merely for survival or national interest, but for a larger historical purpose defined by Hitler's worldview. To negotiate or retreat would undermine this purpose, eroding morale and shaking the faith that the regime depended upon to sustain itself under increasingly dire circumstances. By late 1943, this ideological rigidity had trapped Germany in a course from which there was no easy escape. The generals knew that a realistic peace would require surrendering conquered territories, accepting occupation, and submitting to war crimes tribunals. For Hitler, each of these outcomes was anathema. The surrender of land meant the repudiation of racial and political conquest. Occupation implied humiliation and the loss of German sovereignty. Facing war crimes tribunals threatened not only his ideology, but his very life. In Hitler's mind, compromise was impossible because it represented the collapse of both the project he had built and the man he had become. The refusal to negotiate in 1943, then, was not mere obstinacy. It was the logical extension of an ideology that left no room for retreat, concession, or recognition of reality. The fusion of racial theory, political ambition, and personal identity created a psychological and ideological straitjacket. Germany's defeats, logistical challenges, and the overwhelming power of the Allies mattered little against the immovable barrier of Hitler's belief system. As the generals looked on with growing frustration, it became clear that no argument, no data, and no warning could persuade the man who had bound his personal destiny so tightly to the impossible dream of absolute German supremacy. By 1943, the cracks in Germany's military might were undeniable. Yet Hitler's refusal to consider peace was driven as much by his personal psychology as by ideology. He had constructed his identity around being the savior of the German nation, the man who restored its power and prestige after what he perceived as years of humiliation following World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. To admit defeat or even contemplate compromise was not simply a political decision, it was an existential threat to the very essence of who he believed he was. The idea of failure was incomprehensible because Hitler's entire self-conception depended on triumph and unyielding control. Within the high command, generals were increasingly frustrated. Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl carefully outlined the stark reality. Germany's resources were dwindling, the Wehrmacht was stretched thin across multiple fronts, and the Allies' combined industrial output dwarfed German production. They emphasized that continued offensive operations risked annihilation, not victory. Yet Hitler often reacted with anger and disbelief. He could not absorb the notion that plans, strategies, or even his instincts might be wrong. For him, admitting error was akin to admitting weakness, and weakness was incompatible with leadership, destiny, and the racial ideology he championed. Hitler's refusal was further reinforced by a profound need to maintain control at all costs. He had centralized decision-making to such an extreme that few generals dared to contradict him openly. Every tactical suggestion that implied compromise or cowardice was interpreted as disloyalty or cowardice. The psychological environment he created ensured that only affirmation of his vision was tolerated. Those who spoke truth to him risked not only professional disgrace, but personal punishment. This combination of fear, ego, and ideological certainty created a closed feedback loop. Hitler was surrounded by yes-men and subordinates who, for survival, reinforced his belief in his infallibility. The Führer's psychological makeup also magnified his strategic miscalculations. He consistently overestimated the resilience of the Wehrmacht and underestimated the coordination and capacity of the Allies. Each setback was reframed as temporary, the result of insufficient effort or the missteps of others, rather than a reflection of Germany's strategic overreach. Even after Stalingrad, he could describe the surrender as a temporary disaster or blame the generals for not fully implementing his vision. His mind filtered reality through a lens of denial, maintaining the illusion that victory remained within reach if only he remained unwavering. Compounding this, Hitler's obsession with destiny and historical significance created a paralyzing fear of legacy. He did not merely want to win the war, he wanted to be remembered as the architect of Germany's rise and the founder of a regime that would last a millennium. Failure, in any form, threatened not only Germany's future, but also his personal immortality in history. This obsession made compromise psychologically impossible. Every concession would have been interpreted as personal humiliation, a stain on the historical record he sought to control. Even when faced with evidence of irretrievable losses, Hitler often clung to extreme measures. He demanded counteroffensives on multiple fronts simultaneously, insisting on victories that were logistically impossible. He ordered defenses of cities he knew were indefensible, preferring symbolic stands over strategic retreats. These decisions were not simply errors of calculation, they were expressions of a mind incapable of tolerating failure, driven by fear of shame, loss of control, and the collapse of personal and ideological identity. Hitler's psychological rigidity also affected those around him. Generals and advisors, aware of Germany's peril, attempted to reason with him using maps, troop movements, and resource reports. Their arguments, grounded in pragmatism, often fell on deaf ears. Each rational assessment was filtered through Hitler's ego and perceived threats to his authority. Even those closest to him struggled to penetrate the mental fortress he had constructed, a combination of ideological fanaticism and personal hubris. As 1943 progressed, the consequences of this psychological refusal became increasingly clear. The Wehrmacht manpower and equipment were exhausted, supply lines were overstretched, and the Allies' ability to replace losses far exceeded Germany's capacity. Every failed offensive deepened the crisis, yet Hitler's refusal to confront reality intensified. He clung to visions of decisive victories, believing that one bold move could restore Germany's dominance and validate his leadership. In truth, these plans were disconnected from operational reality, reflecting not strategy, but the compulsions of a mind incapable of accepting failure. Hitler's personal obsession with being the embodiment of Germany's destiny also led him to extreme measures on the home front. Propaganda emphasized heroic sacrifice, portraying every setback as a test of will, and every victory, real or imagined, as proof of German supremacy. Citizens were expected to endure shortages and hardships, soldiers to fight beyond exhaustion, and the military hierarchy to execute impossible orders without question. This psychological grip over both the nation and the army ensured that compromise or peace was not only politically unacceptable, but personally unthinkable for Hitler. By the end of 1943, Germany's military and strategic position was deteriorating rapidly, but Hitler's personal psychology prevented him from adapting. The combination of ego, fear of humiliation, obsessive identification with destiny, and inability to accept failure created a reality in which negotiation, retreat, or compromise were inconceivable. Even as generals pleaded for rational action, Hitler's mind remained fixed on a path defined by personal survival and legacy and absolute adherence to a vision that reality no longer supported. Every choice, every order, and every refusal to acknowledge defeat reinforced the trajectory toward disaster. The psychological chains binding Hitler ensured that Germany could not alter course even when every fact, every report, and every battlefield outcome demanded it. By 1943, Germany faced an increasingly coordinated and overwhelming Allied coalition, yet Hitler's strategic calculations were consistently flawed. Despite mounting evidence that the combined industrial and military might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union dwarfed Germany's own, Hitler clung to the belief that the Allies were inherently divided and that ideological differences would inevitably fracture their unity. He assumed that the Soviets and Western powers could not maintain a coordinated effort against Germany, underestimating the determination, discipline, and shared purpose of the Allies. Hitler's misreading of the Allied coalition began with the East. He believed the Soviet Union, despite its enormous manpower, harsh climate, and industrial capacity, could be broken through a series of decisive campaigns. He assumed that supply issues, internal dissent, and political instability would eventually sap Soviet resistance. The victories of 1941 and 1942, particularly early advances into Ukraine and towards Moscow, reinforced his overconfidence. Yet the Battle of Stalingrad shattered these illusions. The encirclement and surrender of the German Sixth Army exposed the limitations of blitzkrieg tactics and demonstrated the Soviets' ability to mobilize, reinforce, and counterattack at scale. Hitler, however, reframed the defeat as a temporary setback, convinced that further offensives would eventually force the Soviets to collapse. In the West, Hitler misjudged the resolve and efficiency of the Anglo-American forces. He assumed that Britain, weakened by the Blitz and dependent on American support, would soon prioritize its own survival over continental conquest. He underestimated the United States' capacity to produce weapons, vehicles, and supplies at a scale that Germany could never match. Factories in the United States were turning out thousands of aircraft, tanks, and rifles every month, and the Allied supply chains could sustain operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. Hitler viewed these realities through a lens of skepticism and denial, insisting that the coalition would soon encounter internal friction, logistical strain, or political disagreement that would force them to negotiate. Hitler's miscalculations were compounded by his obsession with offensive strategy. He consistently prioritized attacks over defensive planning, believing that bold, decisive strikes could reverse Germany's declining position. At Kursk, he ordered one of the largest tank offensives in history, expecting that a concentrated armored attack could regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Instead, the Soviets were prepared with extensive defenses, minefields, and anti-tank networks, resulting in catastrophic German losses. The failure at Kursk was not just a military defeat, it was proof that Hitler's reliance on audacious maneuvers and underestimation of enemy capabilities was increasingly dangerous. Even as generals warned him of Germany's overextension, Hitler dismissed their concerns. He believed that rapid, dramatic victories could change the strategic calculus, that skillful maneuvering or surprise attacks could shatter the Allies before their overwhelming resources became decisive. This faith in tactical brilliance over logistical and material reality blinded him to the fact that Germany's production, manpower, and supplies were insufficient to sustain protracted multi-front warfare. Hitler also misunderstood the importance of intelligence and coordination on the Allied side. He assumed the Western powers would prioritize political considerations over military effectiveness, and that differences in ideology, objectives, or personalities would lead to disunity. In reality, the Allies had established sophisticated communication networks, coordinated strategic planning, and shared intelligence that allowed them to execute large-scale operations efficiently. From the North African campaign to the buildup for eventual invasion of Western Europe, the Allies demonstrated a level of organization that Hitler repeatedly failed to anticipate or appreciate. In the Mediterranean, Hitler overestimated the security provided by Italian forces and underestimated the consequences of Italy's collapse. Mussolini's overthrow and the Italian surrender created a new front along the southern borders of Europe. German troops were forced to divert resources to hold defensive positions in Italy, while simultaneously conducting offensives in the east and preparing for potential threats in France. Hitler's assumption that Italy could be relied upon as an ally had proved disastrously wrong, yet he interpreted the crisis as a temporary complication rather than a structural failure in his strategic planning. Hitler's miscalculations extended to logistics and production. He assumed that Germany could continue to fight on multiple fronts without fully acknowledging the limitations of fuel, ammunition, and transport. Allied bombing campaigns further disrupted production and supply lines, while the relentless advance of the Red Army on the Eastern Front stretched Germany's forces beyond sustainable limits. Every failed offensive and logistical bottleneck reinforced the pattern of misjudgment, yet Hitler remained convinced that a single decisive operation could restore Germany's dominance. The combination of overconfidence, denial, and selective interpretation of intelligence created a dangerous spiral. Hitler interpreted setbacks as temporary, downplayed failures, and assumed the Allies would self-destruct before German forces were exhausted. This misreading of both the enemy's capabilities and the strategic situation ensured that even as Germany's position became increasingly untenable, Hitler refused to consider negotiation or strategic retreat. Every error in judgment, every failed offensive, and every miscalculation reinforced the belief that victory remained achievable if only his bold vision was pursued to its extreme. By the end of 1943, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond repair. The East demanded constant defense against a growing Soviet force. The West required vigilance against the expanding Anglo-American presence. The Mediterranean front was in crisis, and internal production could not match the demands of a multi-front war. Yet Hitler's misreading of the Allies, combined with his obsession with offensive strategy, created the illusion that Germany still had options. His strategic miscalculations were not simply errors, they were the result of a mindset that refused to acknowledge reality, overestimated German capacity, and underestimated the cohesion and determination of the Allied coalition. This refusal to adapt, to reconcile ambition with material reality, and to recognize the industrial and logistical superiority of the Allies would continue to drive Germany toward catastrophic decisions in 1944. The belief that the coalition could fracture, that tactical brilliance could compensate for strategic weakness, and that Germany's destiny remained under his personal control made negotiation impossible. Hitler's strategic miscalculations were not simply errors, they were the product of an unyielding worldview that ignored fact, underestimated the enemy, and ultimately condemned Germany to a course from which recovery was impossible. By late 1943, Germany's military position was rapidly collapsing on every front. The Eastern Front was stretched beyond endurance, the Red Army advancing with overwhelming force, reclaiming territory lost in previous years. In the West, the Anglo-American forces were building the logistical foundation for the liberation of France. And in the Mediterranean, Italy had turned against Germany, forcing Hitler to commit troops to defend an increasingly untenable southern flank. Despite this, Hitler's response was not to consider negotiation, consolidation, or retreat. It was a nihilistic insistence on total war, a refusal to acknowledge the reality that Germany could no longer achieve victory. This refusal was rooted in a convergence of ideology, ego, and personal obsession. Hitler's belief in the racial and historical destiny of Germany made compromise impossible. Surrender would mean abandoning the very principles that had justified conquest, extermination, and occupation. It would mean admitting that the people he had deemed inferior, Britons, Americans, and Soviets, were capable of defeating him. In his mind, any form of concession or negotiation was tantamount to ideological betrayal. To accept peace would not only endanger the Reich's territorial ambitions, but also shatter the narrative of German supremacy that Hitler had built over decades. Personal ego compounded these ideological barriers. Hitler did not see himself as a leader who could negotiate or adapt. He saw himself as the embodiment of German destiny. Failure was not a political inconvenience, it was a personal annihilation. Every defeat, every setback, and every lost soldier was interpreted not merely as a military loss, but as an affront to his identity. The surrender of Stalingrad, the failure at Kursk, and the collapse of Italy's alliance were all events that Hitler reframed through a lens of defiance, insisting that continued resistance was the only path consistent with his own survival in history. By this point, the generals around him were desperate. Keitel, Jodl, and other senior officers repeatedly warned that Germany could not sustain the multi-front war it was fighting. They urged consideration of peace or strategic withdrawal, highlighting the disparity between German and Allied production, the exhaustion of troops, and the logistical impossibility of continued offensive operations. Yet Hitler dismissed these arguments as cowardly, believing that any act of concession would destroy both morale and the historical legitimacy of the regime. The nihilism of Hitler's approach became increasingly apparent in both strategy and rhetoric. He embraced the notion that if Germany could not achieve complete victory, then the nation and its institutions should suffer to the utmost rather than compromise. Cities were to be defended to the last man, even when strategically indefensible. Resources were poured into futile offensives, and scorched earth orders were prepared for territories that might fall to the enemy. In Hitler's mind, destruction was preferable to submission, and sacrifice without purpose was still preferable to surrender. Allied intelligence and planning revealed the desperation inherent in Hitler's approach, yet it also highlighted the danger of a leadership operating entirely disconnected from reality. By clinging to the illusion that the Allies might fracture, that bold operations could turn the tide, and that German resolve could force recognition, Hitler condemned the Reich to increasingly catastrophic decisions. Every failed offensive, every encirclement, and every lost city intensified the inevitability of defeat. Yet Hitler framed every disaster as a temporary setback, reinforcing his path of total refusal. The home front bore the consequences of this nihilism. Bombing campaigns, resource shortages, and the growing casualty toll eroded civilian morale. Yet propaganda, controlled entirely by the regime, glorified sacrifice and framed every hardship as a necessary test of national and racial resolve. Hitler's refusal to negotiate was thus mirrored by a societal expectation of unrelenting endurance. Citizens were to suffer, soldiers were to die, and generals were to execute orders that often defied reason, all in service of a vision that had become detached from operational or strategic reality. Even as winter approached and the scale of Allied material and manpower superiority became undeniable, Hitler's stance remained rigid. There was no plan to consolidate, no attempt to negotiate from a relative position of strength, and no acknowledgement of Germany's strategic vulnerability. Every discussion of peace or compromise was interpreted as treachery, every call for realism dismissed. The fusion of ideology, personal ego, and a nihilistic view of warfare created a straitjacket from which Germany could not escape. By the end of 1943, the trajectory was clear. Hitler's absolute refusal to end the war ensured that Germany would continue to fight, not because victory was possible, but because surrender or negotiation was inconceivable. The convergence of psychological obsession, ideological extremism, and strategic miscalculation had created a scenario in which the Reich's destruction became almost inevitable. Every general understood this reality. Every loss reinforced it, yet Hitler remained committed to a vision that demanded continued resistance, total commitment, and the ultimate sacrifice of the nation for a dream that was already slipping beyond reach. The stage was set for 1944 and beyond, a period in which the consequences of Hitler's total refusal would become tragically apparent. Military defeats, civilian suffering, and the collapse of infrastructure were the direct result of a leadership that equated survival with victory, refusal with honor, and compromise with betrayal. Germany, locked in the grip of its leader's personal and ideological obsession, was moving inexorably towards devastation. The war that could have been tempered, negotiated, or strategically paused was instead escalated to a level that ensured total destruction, not just of armies, but of cities, civilians, and the very structure of the nation.